They despised one another on first sight. The moment that like the bass and drums kind of locked in together, they sort of looked at each other and they were like, oh, they set up in the back of this church where Peter was living at the time and started playing, and it was like instant. Simon hates Garfunkel. Even Hall is suing Oates. The Beatles is a terrible name for any band. So at that party, like there was another band that played, maybe two other bands. Everyone got a good reception, but when R.E.M. got up to play, I talked to like a dozen different people who were at that show, and they were like, everybody was like, holy shit, like these guys are something else. It's like immediately people picked up on the fact that this band was different. Michael, according to legend, picked up a dictionary and was flipping through it, and then he got to R.E.M. The name of this band is R.E.M., and this is what we do. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, bam!
Welcome to the Interlocutor Podcast. I'm Tyrel Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Peter Ames Carlin. Peter is a journalist, author, and regular speaker on music, writing, and popular culture. He's the author of several books, including Homeward Bound, The Life of Paul Simon, and Bruce, a biography of Bruce Springsteen. He joins me to talk about his 2023 biography of the band R.E.M. Peter, thanks for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start off by asking you a little of what life was like growing up in Seattle in the 1970s. I did a quick search of what was going on there in the 70s. They were building lots of parks in the city, an aquarium. The baseball team came to town. There was the first Pride Week there. And there was also a housing crisis at the beginning of that decade. So what was your experience like growing up there at that time?
Well, I was a kid. It was interesting. It was, my parents moved here, I should say, since I'm in Seattle again, when I was about a year and a half. And so it was essentially, I feel like a native. I always, I grew up there. And so, but it was interesting coming from the East, because the one thing about the West in the United States is that it's so void of history, at least more than like a century old, like 100 years old. A thing that's 100 years old here is like from time immemorial. And people come west to shed their past and to recreate themselves in some other image, And so coming out here was, growing up on my street and on Capitol Hill, it was just interesting to me that like one of my neighbors was, Israeli, his family came from Israel, and the kid next to him was, a Roman Catholic Italian family. My other friends were Episcopals, and my family was Jewish. But everybody, by and large, had more or less absented themselves from their traditions and, whatever history that used to bind people. So that process of, moving west from the old country to the new world, just sort of for the people that then continued 3,000 additional miles to the West Coast, that sense of shedding the past and, and stepping off into a new world was very, and a fresh place where you could completely redesign yourself and be whatever you felt like being without any ties to to history was really, especially in the 70s, it was a time of relatively progressive politics. And it was felt like a very sort of freeing and in a way, optimistic time. Certainly when you were in grade school, at any rate, and then high school. But it was, it was modern America in the late 20th century, and with all of the pluses and minuses that go along with it.
Could you share a little about what your relationship to books was growing up and when you discovered a passion for writing?
Sure. I always, I guess, as a kid, I was always drawn to popular culture stuff. There weren't a lot of, there wasn't a lot of like pop culture biography in those days. I was a huge Beatle fan from the time I was really young, from the time I was 3 or so. And there were maybe 2 books about the Beatles that existed that Hunter Davis's authorized biography. And then there was a book by two guys out of England named Roy Carr and Tony Tyler that was like an illustrated history that sort of had a lot of pictures and, and essays about the different records and stuff. And so I kind of read that stuff. I liked sports books for a time when I was little, but then when I started becoming an adolescent, I became much more interested in modern fiction, Philip Roth. And I read a lot of Roth. I liked stuff that was kind of dark and funny. I remember reading Orwell when I was in high school, and sort of working my way up into Hemingway. And I remember, certainly from the time I was in college and after that, I was very taken with Hemingway for all the reasons, just how lean and powerful his sentences were, and how, he had sort of created this very sort of essential American vocabulary, and the way that he managed to invest so much humanity and feeling into descriptions of the natural world. And I always found that to be, extraordinarily moving. And then at the same time, though, I was also reading a lot of Tom Wolfe and Hunter Thompson and kind of the new journalists, that sense of iconoclasm and the colorful language and the emphasis on humor and analysis in the context of writing nonfiction, I thought was extraordinary. And I was, reading like the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, Tom Wolfe's great book about the late 60s and the hippie movement in San Francisco, was extraordinary for me right at the time I was beginning to discover like the Grateful Dead, and kind of coming to terms with like what they symbolized and what their music was about. So, those were the things that really began to kind of fill up my consciousness. And when, I studied English in college, and when I graduated, and suddenly realized like, oh, Jesus, I need to start taking something seriously. Writing had always come easily to me, which was immensely appealing to me because I'm profoundly lazy by nature. And I liked doing it, and it felt like a way that I could be a wise ass and declaim on issues, and get attention, which was always really important to me as a younger person. And so the combination of it being, sort of stumbling into something that I seemed to excel at, that people said I was good at, that I sort of enjoyed doing, that allowed me to exercise so much of my creativity, was, eventually, that's what I went to pretty much out of the gate from college. And that's all I've ever done, really.
You mentioned a brief interest in sports in the past. I was wondering if you could tell me about the influence of a book by a guy named Jim Bouton, a book called Ball 4, and how you connect that to the work that you do.
Jim, just one moment. I'm sorry. I got so excited I kicked out the plug and knocked over my computer. But what I'm trying to do is, oh Lordy, I might have even broken my charger. That was an ill-timed impulse. On 1 second, and I'm going to try to complete this since it's been I wanted to show you that I had this. This is the original paperback from I think this is the version that came out in 1971. This is actually an amazing book. I don't even really care for baseball that much. I'm not a huge baseball fan. Never was. Like growing up in the West Coast of the U.S., it just doesn't have the same like visceral baseball tradition that the East does. But my dad and my brother turned me on to that book when I was little, and it's essentially this guy's memoir of a single season in the major leagues. And he's older by then. He's like about 30, 31 years old. And he used to be a really powerful fastball pitcher, but he hurt his arm. And so he ended up having to develop the knuckleball, which is, if you know baseball at all, I barely do, but I can tell you the knuckleball, it's an eccentric pitch where it's not about speed, but you throw it in such a way that the ball has no spin. And as a result, any breeze coming through will make the ball jump around. And so when your knuckleball is working, it's nearly impossible to hit. And so he's developed this pitch and he's trying to make a go of it as a relief pitcher. And but the coaches, and all this is taking place in the season of 1969, which is sort of the height, the same summer as Woodstock, the same, it's the hippie era. And he's very much, his hair's always a little too long, and he's he's a nonconformist. And in an institution like professional baseball, like he freaks everyone out, and he's very, very funny and very, very, so it's just, in a way, it's a book that in some ways is about baseball, but what it's really about is the challenge of being an individual in an extremely conformist institution. And so it sort of becomes, in an interesting, transcendent way, about the United States of America in the midst of the hippie moment and the sort of conflict, the generation gap conflict. And what Boughton does in his book, while also taking you deep inside the baseball world. And it was the first kind of warts and all sports book. Like, up until that point, they were all just sort of clean cut, American boys playing the great game. And he was like, no, everyone's drinking and picking up women and swearing and doing the most outrageous shit you can imagine. And anyway, so I first read that book probably when I was 7 or 8, and I've read it 20 times since then. It's hysterically funny. And it's just, to me, it's just a beautifully done piece of writing. So that's Ball 4.
That was an even better connection than I imagined to some of the topics we'll talk about with R.E.M. Transitioning to that topic in R.E.M., could we go back to the beginning in Georgia? Could you talk about how that band got together?
Sure. Well, Bill and Mike had been school kids together in Macon, Georgia. And entertainingly enough, they despised one another on first sight. Bill was a little bit of a rowdy, kind of grumpy, sort of ran with the bad boys. And Mike Mills was this clean cut, sort of very well dressed, he was like the kid that you would really wanted to bring home to mom, because he was so polite and well mannered and was always on the honor roll, always got great grades, just effortlessly. And so Bill caught sight of this kid when they were in 9th grade and was just like, hate that guy. It's like he symbolized every single thing he could not tolerate in another kid. But then they ended up at a jam session together, or Bill, like in Mike's basement, his family's basement, they had some mutual friends and they got together to play some songs. And by that point, Bill was playing the drums and Mike could play virtually everything, but had settled on the bass. And they both described, Bill describes having set up his drums and suddenly he sees this fucking Mike Mills kid show up and he's like, like he goes, if he had played like a guitar, he would have just packed it up and left. Like, that's how much he hated him. But he already had his drums all unpacked. It would have been too awkward to get up and leave. So they started playing together. And the moment that like the bass and drums kind of locked in together, they sort of looked at each other and they were like, oh, and so they played together for an hour or two. And by the time it was over, they both described Bill just looking over his cymbals and catching Mike's eye and going, look, this is ridiculous. Let's just be friends. And then they were best friends and still are to this day, which is very nice. And then eventually, I guess in the fall of, was it the spring of 79? Maybe it was the winter term of 79. They decided together to go to the University of Georgia. They had taken it like a year off or part of a year off. Meanwhile, outside St. Louis in a little town called Collinsville, Illinois, Michael Stipe was a teenager growing up with his dad, who was a career military guy, and falling in love with rock and roll and really, reading the Village Voice, the New York City alternative newspaper, and getting very sort of swept up in the idea of any rate of punk rock and art rock and this really cool sort of underground music scene in New York that The Voice covered so assiduously. And he went down to Athens, I guess, in the very end of 1978. I guess he graduated from high school in 78 and then was kind of goofing around a little bit, or went to junior college, and then decided his parents had moved to Athens. So he went down there sort of against his better instincts, against his will, to live with his family and study at the University of Georgia. Peter Buck had grown up in a suburb of Atlanta, and went to Emory University for a little while in Atlanta, dropped out to work in record stores. He was he played guitar all the time, but never played in bands. But always kind of wanted to play in a band, but also was scared to play in a band, but came up with a very distinctive style of playing because he wasn't interested in being like a soloist like Eric Clapton. He wanted to play in a band and be a rhythm guitar player and write songs and kind of help construct songs. And so he met Michael. He was working at this record store in Athens, and Michael came in, and they both had the same taste in music. And Michael saw Peter playing guitar behind the counter and said, hey, and they started talking, and it turned out that Michael had been in cover bands in high school and was in one in Athens. But he still wasn't playing the type of music he wanted to. And Peter wasn't in anybody's band. They decided to start jamming and trying to write songs. And then they had a mutual friend who introduced them to Bill and Mike. And they finally decided to get together and see what kind of noise they could make as a foursome playing music. And they set up in the back of this church where Peter was living at the time, this disused Episcopal church on Oconee Avenue in Athens, St. Mary's, and set up their gear and started playing. And it was like instant. They all felt like this is working out. That was in about January of 1980, and they kind of woodshedded for a few months and worked out a bunch of their favorite songs they wanted to cover, wrote a few songs. Peter and Michael had been writing some songs. They kind of cobbled them together with some things that Bill and Mike were doing and came up with the sound that, by the time they played their first show, which was at a friend's birthday party in the church, sort of in the same part of the church where they'd been rehearsing with a whole bunch of, university students and Athens bohemians at this thing. They made this, another band. There was a scene in Athens of these kind of arty bands that a lot of them were connected with the art department at the university that was very weirdly instrumental in the creation of every big band you've heard of that came out of Athens. The people in the B-52s were sort of art department adjacent. I don't know if any of them actually studied at the art department, but they had a lot of friends there. Pylon, they were all art students. And Michael Stipe obviously was an art student at the University of Georgia, all these other bands. And so there was this scene, this kind of art music scene of kind of danceable, sort of punkish, arty music that, and part of what the aesthetic was about was amateurism and being self-invented. And so a lot of these bands, when they came together, it would be like, 3, 4, 5 people would get together and say, let's be a band. What instrument do you want to learn how to play? Like they would, like the guys in Pylon, like they formed a band and, other than the drummer, none of them had ever played in a band before. They had never played the instruments. And so it was like the guy, Michael Lahusky, who's like one of the co-founders of Pylon, was like, I'll play the bass. It's got 2 fewer strings, so it'll be easier for me to learn. But they created, what they managed to do was turn their lack of training into a kind of an aesthetic asset, because they couldn't play by the rules. So they invented their own rules and invented a kind of styles of music and sounds and textures that no one else was using. And R.E.M. kind of came out of that. But the difference with them is that they were, certainly Bill and Mike were very experienced musicians, playing in a band that was quite successful, a cover band in Macon. And Michael was a great singer and was incredibly talented. And Peter had been just playing guitar by himself for years, hours and hours every day, and had mastered a style that was, he wasn't, there was a lot of stuff he didn't know, but what he did know how to do, he did so distinctively. It just created this textural sound this texture of sound that was immediately striking. So at that party, like there was another band that played, maybe two other bands, you know, everyone got a good reception. But when R.E.M. got up to play, they didn't have their name yet. It was like people described it. I talked to like a dozen different people who were at that show, and they were like, everybody was like, holy shit, like these guys are something else. It's like immediately people picked up on the fact that this band was different. And they fairly immediately began to get shows in the clubs in Athens. And within a couple months, they were getting shows in Atlanta, and then they began to kind of play college towns around the Southeast. And their growth as an artistic unit and a performance unit, and I don't want to say commercial entity, but as a band with a following, their following grew like from every time they played somewhere, they'd have another handful of like stone cold fans who would come the next time and bring their friends.
You mentioned they found the name R.E.M. How did they decide upon that name?
They had a bunch of really bad names they were kicking around, and I think they were called, I think the first show, like, I don't know, I'm kind of rusty. What they were called, like the Torn Kites or the something Kites. But then they had all sorts of really even worse names than that, like the Negro Wives for some reason, or Negro Eyes. They kept. I mean, that's as we say these days, slightly problematic. Which isn't to say that there was anything diminishing about it. I think they just liked the word. And there were some other Slut Wives was one of the names. Cans O' Piss. And finally they were like, none of that works. And they had, I think their second show, somebody wanted to make a poster and said, we need a name. And so they sat down like, what are we going to call ourselves? And Michael, according to legend, picked up a dictionary and was flipping through it. And then he got to R.E.M. And he said, like, he didn't even connect with the fact that R.E.M. is, describes a stage of sleep, the very deepest sleep when you're dreaming. But he was very taken with, he says, the periods between the letters and the fact that it was like this word that was familiar, but distinctive, and not everybody knew what it meant. And they've spent the rest of their career saying, yeah, it doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean sleeping. That's not what we're talking about. It's something completely different. So that was the name they came up with. And in a weird way, a great band name distills something about the band, about their aesthetic and about their sort of joint identity that maybe you can't quite put your finger on, and R.E.M. is a great name for them in the same way that like the Grateful Dead was a great name for that band. And strangely, the Beatles is a terrible name for any band, but somehow, but the Beatles were so great that they completely transcended their shitty name. Or the Beach Boys for that matter. It's a terrible name for a band, for the band they became. But, oh well, And anyway, R.E.M., there are a lot of good names came out of Athens. B-52s, the Side Effects, Pylon, all these great bands. That's the one thing those kids could definitely do, is come up with a good band name.
Once they started making a little bit of money, enough that they could live as starving artists, Peter got them together and said, I've read about what breaks bands apart, and it's happened many times. Let's just agree that any song written by R.E.M., we each are 25% of the writers. Any dollar made by R.E.M., we each get a quarter of it. And that's that. And that decision and that forethought held that band together for over 30 years. I can't help but connect that to, you said that Peter, like Mike Mills, was a highly intelligent kid, and to me that demonstrates a lot of forethought and really sound decision-making.
Well, he was one of those kids who, a thing that Peter and I have in common, above and beyond being named Peter, is we spent a lot of time when we were young reading a ton of rock and roll books and rock and roll magazines. And he was like making a study of like, well, what are these careers like? Like, what do you have to do to become a rock star? And what after that happens, like, how do you stay that way? Like, how do you not flame out or break up and what he realized is like, well, the two things that break up all these bands are credit and money. And so if we want to hold our band together, we're just going to have to decide before there's anything to argue about. Like, let's just resolve the argument right now. And in a sense, I mean, you have to give credit to Mike Mills because one of the very first songs that they started performing, which is still one of their, songs that people love the most, is Don't Go Back to Rockville. And that's 100% his composition. He wrote the words, he wrote the music, he wrote the melody. Right off the bat, that was like in May of 1980 composition. And yet when the song appeared on an album, I think it was on Reckoning, it was credited to R.E.M., all four of them. So it's like he was the first guy who was like, here's my song, let's give us all credit for it. And that's a big move. And they all, one of the things that was, and I think remains admirable about these guys and heartening, is the fact that they went through as much as they went through without ever really having a serious public fight, and they never had a point where people were estranged from each other. And even now, all these years later, when you see them together or you hear about them hanging out together, there's just a real closeness and a caring, and a real, like, they actually seem to love each other in a way, like brothers, which is really sweet and moving, and you hear about one member or the other maybe having a rough time or something like that. And when that happens, the other three are there to be a helper and to support them and help them stay on track. And I think that's lovely. It's so nice. Like when I'm still so chagrined that Hall and Oates broke up so unhappily. It's like that was a duo that had been around for 50 plus years, and a lot of great tunes. Not my favorite band in the world, but they've just always been around. And now suddenly it's like Bruce, I saw a Bruce Springsteen show a few months ago, and he was talking about bands breaking up and how they all the partnerships break down. And he goes, I can't remember what he was saying, like, Simon hates Garfunkel. Even Hall is suing Oates. It's like, and this is exactly right. But in this case, the guys have always, it's nice that they have that, like, they were like one of the most emotionally mature rock bands ever, especially for a band that got as big as they did. Because generally there's like a truism in the music industry. And it's like, if you want to make a band break up, if you want to make sure a band breaks up, make them successful and just stand back and watch it happen. So, but they defied that usual rule of thumb.
And I got the sense, too, when you were writing about their early years, that none of them wanted the spotlight. They wanted to spotlight the music. As a group of four, they wanted to push the songs out in front and say, this is our music. And none of them wanted to be an individual person ahead of the band.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, it's one of the producers I think I talked to, or engineers, said who made a record with them, said that it was extraordinary. He goes, they're the only band I've ever worked with where each member would individually come up to me and tell me to mix them lower in the song, because usually everyone wants to be the star. It's I'm the star, you're just blah blah blah, and these guys are like no. And to the extent that Michael Stipe was like the face of the band and the guy in the spotlight, who had to who was like the guy, like when they took pictures of the band, like for record covers or magazines or whatever, Michael's usually a little ahead of the other guys, like he's the front man. And the other guys, rather than being chagrined that they're not getting the spotlight, are like, great, you do that, because that's, it's like then that what they used to call him the face. Because you're the one, not only does it take that much more energy to kind of channel the force of, the music through you, but also project, again, the identity of the outfit, the aesthetic of the band, the vibe of the moment. Like, you're the guy that's like introducing the songs and talking to the crowd and keeping things moving and being like animating the idea of this band and this music that you're making in all these other ways. And the other guys just get to stand back and take a sip of water or tune their guitar or whatever and get a moment to catch their breath. And Michael's the one who's got to be, wah, and the guy that everybody cares about the most. So like when they want to write about the personal lives of this band, the first guy they talk to is the lead singer, because he's the guy who's in the spotlight. And so it's like these other guys can live their lives and do, kind of with a significantly greater chance at actually being an ordinary citizen when when they climb off stage. But, Michael walks down the street, everybody knows exactly who he is. And apart from like their biggest era, probably any member of R.E.M. could just go to the grocery store and go shopping and not have anybody bug him. But that's not a privilege Michael had for all those years.
Could you talk a little about how this band, by rejecting the mainstream, they slowly developed a following through steady work and finding like-minded people who are interested in this music. And they built this thing so big that rejecting the mainstream sort of redefined the mainstream or pulled the mainstream into them. And they continued doing what they were doing, but they somehow became a mainstream band. So how did they deal with the tensions of this as they were growing into like world-famous rock stars?
Well, it was always a bit of a, it's paradoxical, because on the one hand, they're very intent on being singular, following their own vision and doing exactly what they want to do, certainly in musical terms, and not bending themselves to make it into the mainstream. But at the same time, they were immensely hard workers. And they would travel when they were still in the van, going from show to show, playing clubs and parties and all that stuff. They would go anywhere. And they worked and worked and worked and played constantly. And everywhere they went, they would play these shows that were so powerful. They would just be building these little platoons of fans all over the world, or all over the country, certainly. And at first, it was kind of a cultish thing. Like, there are people with a certain aesthetic, college kids, people that liked arty music would hear them and go like, oh, that's meant for me, and then drag all their friends in to come see this band. But then later, as they developed as musicians and as composers and, and writers, they began to kind of write songs that had more, that had a kind of visceral crunch to them and a melodicism that people began to hear like, I could actually hear this on the radio. And as their music, but first, the process took a long time, which ultimately was a good thing for them, because by the time they began to score like top 10 hits and become famous, they had been at it for nearly 10 years, and they were in their late 20s, early 30s. They were grown up. They weren't young. They weren't like 21 years old and just out of diapers or whatever. They were full grown men who'd had a lot of experience of the world. So by the time people really began to pay attention, they had, they were mature enough and sophisticated enough to be able to deal with it without letting it really, distort who they were. Nevertheless, when you get to the point, as they did in the early 90s, where your records are selling like 10 plus million copies and you're like one of the two biggest bands in the world, then there's a level of celebrity where the pressure ratchets up, and that's the point at which like the media began to be somewhat unrelenting in their demands of like, well, what is, because, Michael Stipe was always at least among his friends, openly, queer, like had relationships with men and women, and that was who he was. But the thing is, it's like, if you're a grown up, mature person, you don't talk to strangers about who you're dating, or who you like to go to bed with. It's nobody's business, right? So it's like when this stuff would come up in the media, he wouldn't want to answer those questions. And so they're developed, and this is also in the middle of the AIDS era, this intense curiosity, like, why is this guy so cagey about who he's sleeping with? How come we never hardly ever see him with women? And why do we hear these rumors about him dating men? And why is he so skinny? He must have AIDS. This is in the middle of the AIDS crisis. And so there was, by the time, especially like Automatic for the People came out, which had a lot of ruminations on death, there was like in the sort of media's imagination, it was like, well, Michael Stipe is clearly suffering from AIDS and he's dying, and that's why he's so skinny and that's why these songs are so dark. At which point, I think he finally realized, like, I'm going to have to speak out here, if only because like there's stigma about being gay, and that's bullshit. And I'm going to come out, step up and strike against that. And by that point, they were so popular and he was so famous and he realized, I can either say or do anything I want, or all the fame will go away and I won't care anyway, because I've already, we're already way more successful than we ever thought we were going to be. And this is more important. And so when he came out in the mid 90s, it was with, this incredible, as loud and proud and with as much, wit and elan as anyone has ever done. And it was, to this day, a lot of gay or queer artists will talk about Michael as like a really transformative figure in being able to live their truths in public without fear or caring what anyone else was going to say. And so that opened up a lot of, from the beginning, I think they always fancied that they were going to try to figure out a way to sort of split the difference between being outsiders and iconoclasts and yet somehow being able to take this message and right to the center of the mainstream and make the world pay attention to them and what they thought and felt. And, that was their project really from the moment they got started. And it worked, obviously worked out great, right? I mean, and they ended up, becoming huge. And despite the fact that they made these songs and albums that were so different from all the other ones you would, that were so innovative and so idiosyncratic. And yet weirdly, that suddenly it's all over the top 10. And they're huge and they're all over MTV and they're wild and different from anything else you've ever seen. And yet somehow they're immensely popular. But the problem was, by the time they got to that tour in 1995, the pressure was so immense. They hadn't toured in half a dozen years by then. They came out to tour at their absolute, height of their popularity. And it was, they made a good job of it. They put on a great show. It was super successful, but I think the pressure began to get to them. And coincidentally or not, that was the tour where, Bill Berry's head exploded on stage. He had an aneurysm go off, and only through incredible good fortune did it turn out that he happened to chose to do that in a city in Switzerland that had all the world's most sophisticated brain surgeons. And so they rushed him off to the hospital when they finally figured out what was going on, into the hands of the best brain surgeons on the planet. And they fixed him up, and he was back on the road after 6 weeks. So it was a rough go, and then Bill quit the band a couple of years later just because he'd had enough. And it was sad for them, and I think it was sad for him. He loved to make music. He loved to hang out with his friends. He could not tolerate the rest of the rock star system. It's too much. It's too hard. It takes too much energy. He was done. He wanted to hang out at home, and there he has remained ever since, and seems like a very, very, very happy guy.
I watched a video clip from 1982 of the band playing in, I think it was Raleigh, North Carolina. And I looked down at some of the comments below, and this is pre-Murmur, pre their first release. And there are all kinds of comments below about how people are proud of the fact that they've been with the band since that time. They've been listening and been a fan of the band even before Murmur came out. You've written a lot about music over the years. I'd like your opinion on why do fans attach such pride in their identity to the fact that they were with the band from the beginning. They were with them before everyone else came along.
I think it's, for a band like R.E.M., I think it's particularly compelling to people because they were so outside the mainstream. You had to be sort of special to to catch them, to get them, to even be on the lookout for them, that your radar was tuned into that direction. And if you did hear it, like if you were one of the people that got the first single, the Radio Free Europe single before it came out, or you saw them in a tiny bar somewhere when they were still playing in pizza parlors or something, it's like you have this sense of like, I got this first. Like my radar is perfectly attuned to them. I picked up the signal. And now I'm part of this community. And it's especially for a band like REM, it's like it's a community of outcasts and people who don't fit in anywhere else. The punk rockers, the art rockers, the weirdos, the fags, all that stuff. Everybody that big jocks will dismiss with homophobic insults, are suddenly it's like, but this thing that I was teased for mercilessly in high school is the thing that makes me belong to this world here. I belong, with this crowd. Like I found my community, and one thing we have in common, or among the things we have in common, is the fact that we all love this band. We love the sound. We love this music. We love the feel. We love how they do this. We love the way they look, and you jump into it and it's like, I found my place. Like these are my people, and I love being part of this community. And then part of the heartbreak for some of these people and why they get so cross when a band begins to make it big is it's like, wait a second, this was my band. It's like they came from my, it's like, how is it that like suddenly all these other losers are listening to this? Like frat boys are listening to this now. It's like sorority girls are dancing around and waving their hands. It's like, I hate those guys. But REM were always like, you know what? Bring us the frat boys, bring us the business majors, and we're gonna plant some weird ideas in their head and watch them go. See if we can't make a difference. Peter tells a story the first time that after they were on David Letterman for the first time. I think their first album had just come out. And it was the first national TV they ever did. And he used to walk like from his apartment in Athens to wherever they practiced, or downtown Athens. There was a Coca-Cola bottling plant, and he would walk by it, with his weird hair and his weird punk clothes. And the guys hanging around outside, on breaks, would always greet him with like, homophobic taunts. That's the only way they could conceive of him. It's like, you faggot, blah, 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 blah. The grand traditional thing to say to people you don't understand. And that went on for months and months. And then they were on Letterman, and he was back in Athens a week later or whatever. And he was making that same walk past the Coke plant. And the same guys that a week earlier had been calling him terrible things were like, hey, we saw you on Letterman. Where you going? And it's like, so it's like suddenly these guys are on board, right? It's like suddenly they're like, oh, that guy's really cool, just because he's been on TV and he seems to be famous now. So it's like that's, part of the opportunity of it, you of being able to take this aesthetic or this set of values that come from, these outsider values and plunking them into the mainstream and telling people like, these aren't losers, these are the coolest people. And then you start to change hearts and minds that way. And so I think, that's part of it. I mean, there's this heartbreaking, it's interesting to hear like people who grew up in Liverpool in the early 60s who used to see the Beatles as just like the neighborhood band that would play at the Cavern at lunchtime. They take a break from school or work or whatever and pay their 10 shillings or whatever it was to go watch the Beatles play at 90 minutes at lunchtime. And so when they began to make hit singles, when Love Me Do was a number 17 hit, and then Please Please Me went to number 1, they're like, hey, but these are our guys, like, how is it that suddenly they're in London and they belong to everybody now? They were supposed to be our band. But and that's just a process that happens over and over and over again. But, maybe it's less now, but certainly back in those days, and all the way through the 80s and 90s in the rock and roll era, that sense of belonging, that sense of connection, of being able to project yourself into these people on stage and see something of yourself in them was hugely affirming and just made the music that much sweeter.
REM from around 1980 to the mid 90s for at least 15 years managed to each year get bigger and bigger, sell more albums with the next one. The steady rise in growth is quite remarkable. It's into the 21st century, after more than 30 years together, they made the decision that we're going to go out while we still like each other. We're still sort of on top, pretty much. I mean, the songs like Losing My Religion, Man on the Moon, these are still huge hits all over the world. But 30 some years, this was enough, and this band is done. We're done with this project.
Yeah. Obviously their popularity waned a little bit from, the height of the mid 90s. Times changed. The cultural wheel is always turning, and you can't be on top forever. Like, you're eventually going to go in and out of, you're going to go out of fashion. And then the question is, how hard do you want to work? What are you willing to do to try to get back onto the big stage? And they weren't really willing to do, they just wanted to continue making the music that mattered to them, that they felt like in that moment. And for the longest time, for quite a few years, it was like, it's still, we're still enjoying this. We're still loving doing this. We're making music that feels important to us, that we enjoy playing, and we have a big catalog of stuff we can play. But then eventually, I think by the time they got to about 2010, after they did their last tour in 2008, and I think they began to feel like, I kind of feel like this has run its course, and we still love, we still care for each other. We still get along, everything's great, but it's like, how long do you want to try to play out the string? Eventually it becomes, you begin to feel like you're, repeating yourself, and it's getting less and less interesting, and it's less and less exciting to you. How long do you want to keep trying to do this? And they got to the point where it was like, we've made more, we've sold more records and more concert tickets and made so much more money than we ever imagined we could. It's like, why push our luck? It's like, why don't we quit while we still like each other, and before we embarrass ourselves? And so they did. They made that one final record. And that's, maybe, to my mind, like the one record of theirs where you can kind of really sense them sputtering and kind of beginning to repeat themselves a little bit. And I could sort of sense, why it sounds the way it did. It's got a few great songs on it, like all their albums do. But there's some songs on there where I'm like, this feels like such a purposeful echo of this era of the band or that era of the band. It's like they're kind of going through the moments and coming up with new songs to kind of evoke those moments in their career. And then it was like, yeah, they were right. It was the perfect time to break up. Now, and then they swore they would never, ever play together again. And so far they've broken that promise like 1.5 times. Once was to play, when they got inducted to the Songwriters Hall of Fame, they played Losing My Religion, just the four of them. And then when the actor Michael Shannon and the musician Jason Narducci, they put together this band and basically go around playing R.E.M. music. And they did a tour this last year where they were playing Fables of the Reconstruction, along with other R.E.M. songs. They're featuring that record. And they came to Athens, and all four members of R.E.M. were there to watch. And then eventually they all came up on stage. And they weren't all playing. I think Peter was on guitar, Michael was singing, I think Bill might have been playing, I can't remember if he was playing guitar or bass, and Bill Berry was just like hitting a tambourine or something. But it was a big moment in Athens because the four members of R.E.M. were on the same stage at the 40 Watt, where they had, one of the very, very first venues they'd ever played, and played there a whole bunch of times. And it was like, hey, they're back. But it's like, you would think that they would at some point do the thing where they go, okay, screw it. They get huge offers every year to reform, like play Coachella, play this festival, that festival, we'll give you an immense payday. And then all the attention you get from that, then what you do is that then you go on your reunion tour for the summer, and you go and play huge shows, with tons of publicity. You play all your old songs, and then you walk away from that tour with tens of millions of dollars. It's like they could do that easily. They could each make generational, another big dose of generational wealth, but they're not doing it. I think like they just feel like they got enough dough, and they're able to put their kids through college, pay the bills, do what they want, live where they want to live, go where they want to go, and do whatever work they feel like doing. I used to live in Portland for a long time, which is where Peter Buck lives now. And he and Scott McCoy, who was like the utility musician for R.E.M. for the second half of their career, they'd produce records together. They're in like 9 different bands together. And I would, and in Portland, it's like they would be playing around in the clubs like all the time, when they weren't on the road, somewhere playing elsewhere. But it was like there was a beautiful time, I could just walk around the corner to my local tavern. And for like a month or so, they were doing a residency. And every week they were there playing their favorite cover songs at 6 o'clock on Wednesday afternoons. And I would just like turn off the computer and stroll around the corner and buy a beer and hang out and stand 10 feet from Peter and watch him play his Rickenbacker on Neil Young songs and Beatles songs and stuff. And he was, I've seen him play to half a dozen people in a club on a rainy Tuesday night in February. And he looks as ecstatic to be playing his guitar for fewer people than are on stage than he was as ecstatic as he was to play at like Rock in Rio for 250,000 people, or play in huge arenas. And it's just like, this guy loves to play rock and roll music, and that's all there is to it. Mike Mills has got his own projects. Michael Stipe is slowly making a solo record and making art everywhere he goes. And Bill plays in bands around Athens, just very, very quietly. And never wants to tour, rarely ever plays live. He just doesn't like the attention. But sometimes he can't resist jumping up and doing a song or two with his friends.
I have just 2 more questions. The second last one is, towards the end of the book, you, for a brief moment, go from being a fly on the wall on these guys' lives to you turn to the reader and you talk to them about the different types of R.E.M. fans. So wondering if you could say what type of R.E.M. fan you are.
Oh, man. I was part of the great migration of fans that came when they began to be played on the radio in the late 80s. Mid to late 80s, like I was aware of them from the early 80s on, but there wasn't a lot of, in the first half, 5-6 years of their career, they would mostly get played on college radio. And so if you lived in a town that had a good college radio station, or you had hip friends that could turn you on to stuff, I would read about them. I think I saw the Letterman show when they were on in 83. I thought, oh, that's kind of cool, but it's not quite what I'm after, because I'm a very, very late stage baby boomer. I was born in 1963. But I was precocious as a music fan. So that hippie era stuff was the music that was my aesthetic, cause that was what was cool when I was first discovering music. And so it took me a while to catch up to the punk stuff and the 80s stuff. And I eventually did. So the first wave of people, I called them the murmurers, the people that love the first album and just think it never got better than that. Cause it's so shadowy and murky and strange. And I'm like, yeah, that's nice. But I kind of like these really distinctive and cool pop songs, with really groovy words and cool textures and stuff. So that's, I got into it in the late 80s and then immediately began to retrofit with the earlier records and stayed on top of it from that point forward. But I missed a lot, I'm sure there's a huge, generations of earlier R.E.M. fans who look at me as an newcomer,
Mm-hmm.
I've only been into it for 35 years. So, a newbie still.
So the last question I want to ask you is about the title of the book. I like asking authors, how do they come up with the titles or subtitles? So in this case, the name of this band is R.E.M. How did you come up with this title, and when in the process of writing the book did you decide you wanted to call it that?
extremely late in the game. Titles are sometimes the last thing. I mean, titles are hard. It's like kind of trying to find a good band name. You know, you're looking for the thing that sort of distills the essence of the work, you know? And sort of it's like, well, what is it about? It's got to be distinctive. It's got to be something, you know, it's always easy if you write music books to cop to the name of a song or the name of an album or something like that. And so I've done that a lot. But I'm trying to get over that and come up with more interesting, distinctive names. So, and I was like, well, what the hell am I going to call this? And what I realized was, you know, from listening to all these live shows that they played from about I can't remember when he started doing it. Maybe it was post mid 90s. Maybe it was after Bill Berry had left the band. Michael would start every show by saying, the name of this band is R.E.M. and this is what we do. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, bam! And then the show would begin. And he did it, you know, it just every show you listen to, that's how he starts it off. And I thought, well, that's cool. The name of this band is R.E.M. And so I proposed that, and my editor was like, yes! And everybody was into it. And it came out. And suddenly, it's like I was never that huge a Talking Heads fan. They're great, you know. When their stuff comes up, I enjoy it, but it's less tuned to my particular aesthetic. There's like 12.5 Talking Heads songs I really love, but I didn't pay very close attention to the different albums and the names and stuff. Anyway, there's a live Talking Heads album called The Name of This Band is Talking Heads, which I had completely forgotten about. And once my book came out, I was like on Facebook or something, and Chris Franz, the drummer from Talking Heads, like posted a photo of the cover of my book, and underneath it wrote like, "What the hell is this? Like, he ripped us off. Like, what the hell is he thinking?" And I was like, "Oh shit!" And so then I just posted a thing. I was like, "Chris, this is what it's a reference to what Michael would say." And then he wrote underneath it something like, "Oh, okay." That was that. But every so often, for a while there at least, I was getting email from cranky Talking Heads fans. Why are you ripping off Talking Heads when you're writing about R.E.M.? It's like, so, you know, I still think it's a cool title. And so I'm not sorry, but I'm sorry for the confusion it caused.
I really enjoyed this opportunity to do a deep dive into this group and learn so much more about them. I really enjoyed the book and the chance to speak with you today. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for reading and for the interview. This has been fun.
Radio doesn't deserve me yet.